Chapter 5. The New German Reich. But there is another message I want to tell you. The ECB is ready to do whatever it takes to preserve the euro, and believe me, it will be enough. Mario Draghi, President of the European Central Bank, July 2012. If there is no crisis, Europe doesn't move. Wolfgang Schäuble, German Minister of Finance, December 2012. The First Reich. Those blithely predicting the breakup of Europe and the euro would do well to understand that we are witnessing the apotheosis of a project first begun 1,200 years ago. A long view of history repeating itself reveals why the euro is the strongest currency in the world. Today, the euro waits in the wings, one more threat to the hegemony of the dollar. Europe has been united before. Not all of it in the geographic sense, but enough to constitute a distinct European polity, in contrast to a mere city, kingdom, or country in the area called Europe. That unity arose in Charlemagne's Frankish Empire, the Frankenreich, near the turn of the 9th century. The similarities of Charlemagne's empire to 21st century Europe are striking and instructive to those, especially in the United States, who struggle to understand European dynamics today. While many focus on the divisions, nationalities, and distinct cultures within Europe, a small group of leaders, supported by their citizens, continue the work of European unification begun in the ashes of the Second World War. United in diversity is the European Union's official motto, and the word united is the theme most often overlooked by the critics and skeptics of a political project now in its 8th decade. Markets are powerful, but politics are more so, and this truth is slowly becoming more apparent on trading floors in London, New York, and Tokyo. Europe and its currency, the euro, despite their flaws and crises, are set to endure. Charlemagne, a late 8th and early 9th century Christian successor to the Roman emperors, was the first emperor in the West following the fall of the Western Roman Empire in AD 476. The Roman Empire was not a true European empire, but a Mediterranean one, although it extended from the Roman heartland to provinces in present-day Spain, France, and even England. Charlemagne was the first emperor to include parts of present-day Germany, the Netherlands, and the Czech Republic, with the former Roman provinces and Italy, to form a unified entity along geographic lines that resemble modern Western Europe. Charlemagne is called, by popes and laymen alike, Pater Europae, the father of Europe. Charlemagne was more than a king and conqueror, although he was both. He prized literacy and scholarship as well as the arts, and he created a court at Aachen comprised of the finest minds of the early Middle Ages, such as St. Alcuin of York, considered the most learned man anywhere by Charlemagne's contemporary and biographer Einhard. The achievements of Charlemagne and his court in education, art, and architecture gave rise to what historians call the Carolingian Renaissance, a burst of light to end an extended Dark Age. Importantly, Charlemagne understood the significance of uniformity throughout his empire for ease of administration, communication, and commerce. He sponsored a Carolingian minuscule script that supplanted numerous forms of writing that had evolved in different parts of Europe, and he instituted administrative and military reforms designed to bind the diverse cultures he had conquered into a cohesive realm. Charlemagne did not pursue his penchant for uniformity past the point necessary for stability. He advocated diversity if it aided his larger goals pertaining to education and religion. He promoted the use of vernacular Romance and German languages by priests, a practice later abandoned by the Catholic Church, and belatedly revived in 1965 by the Second Vatican Council. He accepted vassalage from conquered foes in lieu of destroying their cultures and institutions. In these respects, he embraced a policy the European Union today calls subsidiarity, the idea that uniform regulation should be applied only in areas where it is necessary to achieve efficiencies for the greater good. Otherwise, local custom and practice should prevail. Charlemagne's monetary reforms should seem quite familiar to the European Central Bank. The European monetary standard prior to Charlemagne was the gold sou, derived from solidas, a Byzantine Roman coin introduced by Emperor Constantine I in AD 312. Gold had been supplied to the Roman Empire since ancient times from sources near the Upper Nile and Anatolia. However, Islam's rise in the 7th century and losses in Italy to the Byzantine Empire cut off trade routes between East and West. This resulted in a gold shortage and tight monetary conditions in Charlemagne's Western Empire. He engaged in an early form of quantitative easing by switching to a silver standard, since silver was far more plentiful than gold in the West. He also created a single currency, the livre caroline, equal to a pound of silver, as a measure of weight in money, and the coin of the realm was the denari, equal to 1/20th of a sou. With the increased money supply and standardized coinage, along with other reforms, trade and commerce thrived in the Frankish Empire. Charlemagne's empire lasted only 74 years beyond his death in AD 814. The empire was initially divided into 3 parts, each granted to one of Charlemagne's sons. But a combination of early deaths, illegitimate heirs, fraternal wars, and failed diplomacy led to the empire's long decline and final dissolution in 887. Still, the political foundations for modern France and Germany had been laid. The Frankenreich's legacy lived on until it took a new form with the creation of the Holy Roman Empire and the coronation of Otto I as emperor in 962. That empire, the First Reich, lasted over 8 centuries, until it was dissolved by Napoleon in 1806. By reviving Roman political unity and advancing arts and sciences, Charlemagne and his realm were the most important bridge between ancient Rome and modern Europe. Notwithstanding the institutions of the Holy Roman Empire, the millennium after Charlemagne can be seen largely as a chronicle of looting, war, and conquest set against a background of intermittent ethnic and religious slaughter. The centuries from 900 to 1100 were punctuated by raids and invasions led by Vikings and their Norman descendants. The period 1100 to 1300 was dominated by the Crusades abroad and knightly combat at home. The 14th century saw the Black Death, which killed from 1/3 to 1/2 the population of Europe. The epoch starting with the Counter-Reformation in 1545 was especially bloody. Doctrinal conflicts between Protestants and Catholics turned violent in the French Wars of Religion from 1562 to 1598, then culminated in the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648, a Europe-wide, early modern example of total war, in which civilian populations and non-military targets were destroyed along with armies. The sheer suffering and inhumanity of these latter centuries is captured in this description of the siege of Sancerre in 1572. Sancerre's starving population successively ate their donkeys, mules, horses, cats, and dogs. Then the Sancerrois consumed leather, hides, and parchment documents. Laura Martin, citing the contemporary writer Jean de Lery, describes what came next. The final step was cannibalism. Lery then says the people of Sancerre saw this prodigious crime committed within their walls. For on July 21st it was discovered and confirmed that a grape grower named Simon Potard, Eugene his wife, and an old woman who lived with them, had eaten the head, brains, liver, and innards of their daughter, aged about 3. These bloodbaths were followed by the wars of Louis XIV, waged continually from 1667 to 1714, in which the Sun King pursued an explicit policy of conquest aimed at reuniting France with territory once ruled by Charlemagne. The European major litany of carnage continued with the 7 Years' War from 1754 to 63, the Napoleonic Wars from 1803 to 15, the Franco-Prussian War from 1870 to 71, the First World War, the Second World War, and the Holocaust. By 1946, Europe was spiritually and materially exhausted and looked back with disgust and horror at the bitter fruits of nationalism, chauvinism, religious division, and anti-Semitism. France was involved in every one of these wars, and Franco-German conflict was at the heart of the three most recent, in 1870, 1914, and 1939, all occurring within a 70-year span, a single lifetime. After the Second World War, when the UK wrestled with the demise of its own empire, and a U.S.-Soviet condominium descended in the form of the Iron Curtain and the Cold War, continental statesmen, economists, and intellectuals confronted the central question of how to avoid yet another war between France and Germany. The New Europe. The first step toward a unified federal Europe took place in 1948 with the Hague Congress, which included public intellectuals, professionals, and politicians from both left and right in a broad-based discussion of the potential for political and economic union in Europe. Winston Churchill, Konrad Adenauer, and François Mitterrand, among many others, took part. This was followed in 1949 by the founding of the College of Europe, an elite postgraduate university dedicated to the promotion of solidarity among Western European nations and the training of experts to implement that mission. Behind both the Hague Congress and the College of Europe were the statesmen Paul-Henri Spaak, Robert Schuman, Jean Monnet, and Alcide de Gasperi. The great insight of these leaders was that economic integration would lead to political integration, thereby making war obsolete, if not impossible. The first concrete step toward economic integration was the European Coal and Steel Community, known as the ECSC, launched in 1952. Its 6 original members were France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. The ECSC was a common market for coal and steel, 2 of the largest industries in Europe at the time. In 1957, it was joined by the European Atomic Energy Community, known as Euratom, dedicated to developing the nuclear energy industry in Europe, and also by the European Economic Community, known as the EEC, created by the Treaty of Rome and devoted to creating a common market for Europe for goods and services beyond coal and steel. In 1967, the Merger Treaty unified the ECSC, Euratom, and the EEC under the name of the European Communities, or EC. The 1992 Maastricht Treaty recognized the European Communities as one of the 3 pillars of a new European Union, EU, along with police and judicial cooperation, and a common foreign and security policy, known as CFSP, formed as the representative of the new EU to the rest of the world. Finally, in 2009, the Lisbon Treaty merged the 3 pillars into the sole legal entity of the European Union and named a European Council President to direct general objectives and policies. Alongside this economic and political integration was an equally ambitious effort at monetary integration. At the heart of monetary union is the European Central Bank, known as the ECB, envisioned in the 1992 Maastricht Treaty and legally formed in 1998 pursuant to the Treaty of Amsterdam. The ECB issues the euro, which is a single currency for the 18 nations that are Eurozone members. The ECB conducts monetary policy with a single mandate to maintain price stability in the Eurozone. It also trades in foreign exchange markets as needed to affect the euro's value relative to other currencies. An ECB manages the foreign exchange reserves of the 18 national central banks in the Eurozone and operates a payment platform among those banks called Target 2. At present, Europe's most tangible and visible symbol is the euro. It is literally held, exchanged, earned, or saved by hundreds of millions of Europeans daily, and it is the basis for trillions of euros in transactions conducted by many millions more around the world. In late 2014, the ECB will occupy its new headquarters building, almost 600 feet high, located in a landscaped enclave of eastern Frankfurt. The building is a monument to the permanence and prominence of the ECB and the euro. Many market analysts, Americans in particular, approach Europe and the euro through the lens of efficient markets theory and standard financial models, but with a grossly deficient sense of history. The structural problems in Europe are real enough, and analysts are right to point them out. Glib solutions from the likes of Nobelists Paul Krugman and Joseph Stiglitz that nations like Spain and Greece should exit the Eurozone, revert to their former local currencies, and devalue to improve export competitiveness, ignore how these nations got to the euro in the first place. Italians and Greeks know all too well that the continual local currency devaluations they had suffered in the past were a form of state-sanctioned theft from savers and small businesses for the benefit of banks and informed elites. Theft by devaluation is the technocratic equivalent of theft by looting and war that Europeans set out to eradicate with the entire European project. Europeans see that there are far better options to achieve competitiveness than devaluation. The strength of this vision is confirmed by the fact that pro-Euro forces have ultimately prevailed in every democratic election or referendum, and pro-Euro opinion dominates polls and survey results. Charlemagne's enlightened policies of uniformity, in combination with the continuity of local custom, exist today in the EU's subsidiary principle. The contemporary EU motto, United in Diversity, could as well have been Charlemagne's. From Bretton Woods to Beijing. The Euro project is a part of the more broadly based international monetary system, which itself is subject to considerable stress and periodic reformation. Since the Second World War, the system has passed through distinct phases known as Bretton Woods, the Washington Consensus, and the Beijing Consensus. All three of these phases are shorthand for shared norms of behavior in international finance, what are called the rules of the game. The Washington Consensus arose after the collapse of the Bretton Woods system in the late 1970s. The international monetary system was saved between 1980 and 1983 as Paul Volcker raised interest rates and Ronald Reagan lowered taxes, and together they created the sound dollar or king dollar policy. The combination of higher interest rates, lower taxes, and less regulation made the United States a magnet for savings from around the world and thereby rescued the dollar. By 1985, the dollar was so strong that an international conference was held at the Plaza Hotel in New York in order to reduce its value. This was followed by another international monetary conference in 1987 at the Louvre in Paris that informally stabilized exchange rates. The Plaza and the Louvre Accords cemented the new dollar standard. But the international monetary system was still ad hoc and in search of a coherent set of principles. In 1989, the missing intellectual glue for the new dollar standard was provided by economist John Williamson. In his landmark paper, What Washington Means to Policy Reform, Williamson prescribed the Washington Consensus for good behavior by other countries in the new world of the dollar standard. He made his meaning explicit in the opening paragraphs. He wrote, "No statement about how to deal with the debt crisis would be complete without a call for the debtors to fulfill their part of the proposed bargain by setting their houses in order, undertaking policy reforms, or submitting to strong conditionality." The question posed in this paper is what such phrases mean, and especially what they are generally interpreted as meaning in Washington. The Washington of this paper is both the political Washington of Congress and the administration, and the technocratic Washington of the international financial institutions, the economic agencies of the U.S. government, the Federal Reserve Board, and the think tanks. It is hard to imagine a more blunt statement of global dollar hegemony emanating from Washington, D.C. The omission of any reference to nations other than the United States, or any institution other than those controlled by the United States, speaks to the state of international finance in 1989 and the years that followed. Williamson went on to describe what Washington meant by debtors setting their houses in order. He set forth 10 policies that made up the Washington Consensus. These policies included common sense initiatives such as fiscal discipline, elimination of wasteful subsidies, lower tax rates, positive real interest rates, openness to foreign investment, deregulation, and protection for property rights. The fact that these policies favored free market capitalism and promoted the expansion of U.S. banks and corporations in global markets did not go unnoticed. By the early 2000s, the Washington Consensus was in tatters due to the rise of emerging market economies that viewed dollar hegemony as favoring the United States at their expense. This view was highlighted by the IMF response to the Asian financial crisis of 1997-98, in which IMF austerity plans resulted in riots and bloodshed in the cities of Jakarta and Seoul. Washington's failure over time to adhere to its own fiscal prescriptions, combined with the acceleration of Asian economic growth after 1999, gave rise to the Beijing Consensus as a policy alternative to the Washington Consensus. The Beijing Consensus comes in conflicting versions and lacks the intellectual consistency that Williamson gave to the Washington Consensus. Author Joshua Cooper Ramo is credited with putting the phrase Beijing Consensus into wide use with his seminal 2004 article on the subject. Ramo's analysis, while original and provocative, candidly admits that the definition of Beijing Consensus is amorphous. He writes, "The Beijing Consensus is flexible enough that it is barely classifiable as a doctrine." Despite the numerous economic elements thrown into the stew of the Beijing Consensus, Ramo's most important analytic contribution was the recognition that the new economic paradigm was not solely about economics, but rather was fundamentally geopolitical. The ubiquitous John Williamson expanded on Ramo in 1220 by defining the 5 pillars of the Beijing Consensus as incremental reform, innovation, export-led growth, state capitalism, and authoritarianism. As viewed from China, the Beijing Consensus was a curious blend of 17th century Anglo-Dutch mercantilism and Alexander Hamilton's 18th century American school development policies. As interpreted by the Chinese Communist Party, it consists of protection for domestic industry, export-driven growth, and massive reserve accumulation. No sooner had policy intellectuals defined the Beijing Consensus than it began to break down due to internal contradictions and deviations from the original mercantilist model. China used protectionism to support infant industries as Hamilton recommended, but it failed to follow Hamilton's support of domestic competition. Hamilton used protectionism to give new industries time to establish themselves, but he relied on competition to make them grow stronger so they could eventually hold their own in international trade. In contrast, Chinese elites coddled China's national champions to the point that most are not globally competitive without state subsidies. By 2012, the deficiencies and limits of the Beijing Consensus were plain to see, although the policies were still widely practiced. The Berlin Consensus. By 2012, a new Berlin Consensus emerged from the ashes of the 2008 global financial crisis and the European sovereign debt crises of 2010 to 2011. The Berlin Consensus has no pretensions to be a global one-size-fits-all economic growth model. Rather, it is highly specific to Europe and the evolving institutions of the EU and Eurozone. In particular, it represents the imposition of the successful German model on Europe's periphery through the intermediation of Brussels and the ECB. German Chancellor Angela Merkel has summarized her efforts under the motto of More Europe, but it would be more accurate to say that the project is about more Germany. The Berlin Consensus cannot be fully implemented without structural adjustments in order to make the periphery receptive and complementary to the German model. The Berlin Consensus, as conceived in Germany and applied to the Eurozone, consists of 7 pillars. They are: 1. Promotion of exports through innovation and technology. 2. Low corporate tax rates. 3. Low inflation. 4. Investment in productive infrastructure. 5. Cooperative labor management relations. 6. Globally competitive unit labor costs and labor mobility. And 7. Positive business climate. Each one of the 7 pillars implies policies designed to promote specific goals and produce sustained growth. These policies, in turn, presuppose certain monetary arrangements. At the heart of the Berlin Consensus is a recognition that savings and trade, rather than borrowing and consumption, are the best path to growth. Taking the elements of the Berlin Consensus singly, one begins with the emphasis on innovation and technology as the key to a robust export sector. German companies such as SAP, Siemens, Volkswagen, Daimler, and many others exemplify this ethic. The World Intellectual Property Organization, the WIPO, reports that 6 of the top 10 applicants for international trademark protection in 2012 were EU members. Of 182,112 applications filed under the WIPO Patent Cooperation Treaty in 2011, 27.5% were filed by EU members, 26.8% by the United States, and 9% by China. The EU's attainments in university education, basic research, and intellectual property are now on a par with those of the United States, and well ahead of China's. Intellectual property drives economic growth only to the extent that business can utilize it to create value-added products. A key factor in the ability of business to drive productivity through innovation is a low corporate tax rate. Statutory tax rates are an imperfect guide because they may be higher than the tax rate actually paid due to deductions, credits, and depreciation allowances. Still, the statutory rate is a good starting place for analysis. Here, Europe once again stands out favorably. The average European corporate tax rate is 20.67%, compared to 40% for the United States and 25% for China, once local income taxes are added to national taxes. Corporations in the EU are predominantly taxed on a national basis, meaning taxes paid to a host country only based on profits made in that country, which contrasts favorably with the U.S. system of global taxation, in which a U.S. corporation pays tax on foreign as well as domestic profits. Both the EU and the United States have managed to maintain low inflation in recent years, but Europe has done so with significantly less money printing and yield curve manipulation, which means its potential for future inflation based on changes in the turnover or velocity of money is reduced. In contrast, China has had a persistent problem with inflation due to Chinese efforts to absorb Federal Reserve money printing to maintain a peg between the yuan and the dollar. Of the 3 largest economic zones, the EU has the best track record on inflation, both in terms of recent experience and prospects going forward. The EU's approach to infrastructure investment has resulted in higher quality and more productive investment than that of either the United States or China. Because large infrastructure projects in Europe typically involve cross-border collaboration, they tend to be more economically rational and less subject to political pressures. A prominent example is the Gotthard Base Tunnel, scheduled to open in 2017, which will run 34 miles, end-to-end, beneath the Swiss Alps, which tower 10,000 feet above it. The tunnel will be the longest in the world and has rightly been compared to the Panama Canal and the Suez Canal as a world historic achievement in the advancement of transportation infrastructure for the benefit of trade and commerce. Although the Gotthard Base Tunnel lies entirely in Switzerland, it is a critical link in a Europe-wide high-speed rail transportation network. For passengers, the tunnel will cut an hour off the current 3-hour and 40-minute travel time from Milan to Zurich. For rail freight traffic, the tunnel will increase annual capacity through the Gotthard Pass by 250%, from the current 20 million tons to a projected 50 million tons. The Gotthard-based tunnel will be linked to scores of high-speed rail corridors coordinated by the EU's Trans-European High-Speed Rail Network, called TEN-R. These, and many similar European infrastructure projects, compare favorably in terms of long-term payoffs with Chinese ghost cities and the U.S. practice of wasted investments such as solar cell maker Solyndra and electric car maker Fisker, which both filed for bankruptcy. The German labor management coordination model for large enterprises, called Mitbestimmung, or co-determination, has been in place since the end of the Second World War. It was expanded significantly in 1976 with the requirement that worker delegates hold board seats of any corporation with more than 500 employees. Co-determination does not replace unions, but complements them by allowing worker input in corporate decision-making in a regular and continuous way, in addition to the sporadic and often disruptive processes of collective bargaining and occasional strikes. The model is unique to Germany and may not be copied specifically by other EU members. What is significant about co-determination for Europe is not the exact model, but the example it sets with regard to improving productivity and competitiveness for business. The German model compares favorably with that of China, where workers have few rights, and the United States, where labor management relations are adversarial rather than cooperative. Of the Berlin Consensus pillars, the one most difficult to engender in the EU as a whole, especially in the periphery, is the efficient labor pillar, including lower unit labor costs. Here, the policy is to force internal adjustment through lower nominal wages in euros, rather than external adjustment either by devaluing the euro or by abandoning it in favor of local currencies in countries such as Greece or Spain. Keynesians have argued that the wages are sticky and do not respond to normal supply and demand forces. Paul Krugman puts the conventional Keynesian view as follows. So if there were really a large excess supply of labor, wouldn't we be seeing wages plummeting? And the answer is no. Wages and many prices don't behave like that. It's an interesting question why, but it's simply a fact that actual cuts in nominal wages happen only rarely and under great pressure. So, there is no reason to believe that cutting wages would be helpful. As with much of Keynesianism, this analysis applies at best to the special case of heavily unionized labor in closed markets rather than non-union labor in more open markets. With regard to Europe, Krugman misses the most important point. The emphasis on sticky wages and pay cuts assumes the workers involved already have or had jobs. In Spain, Italy, Greece, Portugal, France, and elsewhere, millions of well-educated youth have never had a job. This labor pool does not have any anchored expectations about how much one should be making. Any job with decent working conditions, training, and possibilities for advancement will prove attractive, even at wages that an older generation might have rejected. The second part of the efficient labor pillar of the Berlin Consensus is labor mobility. As long ago as 1961, Robert Mundell highlighted its importance to a single currency area in his landmark article, A Theory of Optimum Currency Areas. He wrote, "In a currency area comprising many regions and a single currency, the pace of inflation is set by the willingness of central authorities to allow unemployment in deficit regions. Unemployment could be avoided if central banks agreed that the burden of international adjustment should fall on surplus countries, which would then inflate until unemployment in deficit countries is eliminated. A currency area cannot prevent both unemployment and inflation among its members." Although this article was written almost 40 years before the euro's launch, the implications for the Eurozone are pertinent. When the terms of trade turn adverse to the periphery, and in Germany's favor, either the periphery will have unemployment, or Germany will have inflation, or there will be a combination of the two. Since Germany indirectly controls the ECB, and has so far been unwilling to tolerate inflation. Rising unemployment in the periphery is inevitable. Mundell, however, also pointed out that the solution to this dilemma is capital and labor factor mobility across national boundaries. If capital could shift from Germany to Spain to take advantage of abundant labor, or if labor could shift from Spain to Germany to take advantage of abundant capital in the form of plant and equipment, then the unemployment problem could be solved without inflation. EU directives and use of the euro have gone far toward increasing the mobility of capital. However, Europe has lagged behind the rest of the developed world in mobility of labor terms, partly due to linguistic and cultural differences among the national populations. This problem is widely recognized, and because steps are being taken to improve labor mobility within the EU, prospects for growth are greater than many observers believe. This brings the analysis to the final element of the Berlin Consensus: a positive business climate. What economists call regime uncertainty is a principal differentiator between long, anemic depressions and short, sharp ones. Monetary policy and fiscal policy uncertainty can negatively impact an economy, as was seen in the United States during the Great Depression of 1929 to 1940, and as is being seen again in the depression that began in 2007. But policy cannot improve an economy if businesses are unwilling to invest capital and create the new jobs associated with such investment. Once the panic phase of a financially induced depression is over, the greatest impediment to capital investment is uncertainty about policy regimes related to matters such as taxes, healthcare, regulation, and other costs of doing business. Both the United States and the EU suffer from regime uncertainty. The Berlin Consensus is designed to remove as much uncertainty as possible by providing for price stability, sound money, fiscal responsibility, and uniformity across Europe on important regulatory matters. In turn, a positive business climate becomes a magnet for capital, not just from local entrepreneurs and executives, but also from abroad. This points to an emerging driver of EU growth harnessed to the Berlin Consensus: Chinese capital. As the Beijing Consensus collapses and Chinese capital seeks a new home, Chinese investors look increasingly to Europe. Chinese leaders realize they have overinvested in U.S. dollar-denominated assets. They also know they cannot divest those assets quickly. But at the margin, they can invest new reserves in diverse ways, including euro-denominated assets. China was in no hurry to prop up a flailing eurozone in 2011, but now that the EU has stabilized, they find the euro an attractive alternative to dollar-denominated assets. The Washington Post reported on this phenomenon in 2013, when they wrote, "As Chinese companies and entrepreneurs have moved to invest more overseas, they have been drawn increasingly to Europe, where a 2-year surge in foreign direct investment from China has eclipsed the amount flowing to the United States. Over the past 2 years, Chinese companies invested more than $20 billion in the European Union, compared with $11 billion in the United States." The Wall Street Journal reported in July 2013 that the Chinese State Administration for Foreign Exchange, the SAFE, which manages China's reserves, was an early investor in bonds issued by the European Financial Stability Fund, and has invested regularly since then in the bailout fund. A sound euro is an important attraction for Chinese capital because a stable currency mitigates exchange rate risk to investors. Indeed, capital inflows from China provided support for the euro, an example of a positive feedback loop between a sound currency and capital flows. Increasing capital inflows to the eurozone were not limited to those coming from China. The U.S. money market industry has also been investing heavily in the eurozone. After panic outflows in 2011, the 10 largest money market funds in the United States almost doubled their investments in the eurozone between the summer of 2012 and early 2013. The Berlin Consensus is taking root in Europe, based on the 7 pillars and directed as much from the EU and Brussels as from Berlin, to mitigate resentment of Germany's economic dominance. The consensus is powered by a virtuous troika of German technology, periphery youth labor, and Chinese capital. It receives its staying power from a far-sighted blend of low inflation, sound money, and positive real interest rates. The New Berlin Consensus has the potential to replicate the Wirtschaftswunder, Germany's economic miracle, reconstruction after the Second World War, on a continental scale. German Chancellor Angela Merkel was born during German Reconstruction in the 1950s, grew up in communist East Germany, and had first-hand experience with German reunification in the 1990s. Few political leaders anywhere have her experience in facing such daunting development challenges. She is now turning those skills to the greatest development challenge of all, growing the European periphery and preserving the euro at the same time. The Eurosceptics. Europe may have the will to preserve both its unity and the euro, but does it have the means? Events since the 2008 financial crisis have raised considerable doubt in many quarters about Europe's capacity to deal with successive crises, notwithstanding the overriding political objectives of the Berlin Consensus. A close examination reveals that these doubts are misplaced, and that the euro project is considerably more durable than the critics suppose. Foreign exchange and debt markets have existed in a state of continual turmoil since the global sovereign debt crisis erupted with the announcement of default by Dubai World on November 27, 2009. Any visitor to Dubai in the months leading up to the default could see the real estate bubble forming, in the shape of a skyline with miles of empty office buildings and luxury condos for sale. Investors assumed that Dubai, with oil wealth provided by rich neighbors in Abu Dhabi, would muddle through. But it did not. Its collapse became contagious, spreading to Europe and Greece in particular. By early 2010, serious fraud had been uncovered in Greece's national accounting, enabled by off-the-book swaps provided by Goldman Sachs and other Wall Street banks. It became apparent that Greece could not pay its debts without both massive structural reforms and outside assistance. The sovereign debt crisis had gone global and would soon push Ireland and Portugal to the brink of default, raising serious doubts about the public finances of the much larger economies of Spain and Italy. Fears about sovereign finances spread quickly to the banks in those countries most affected, and a feedback loop emerged. Since the banks owned sovereign bonds, any distress in the bonds would impair bank capital. If the banks needed bailouts, the sovereign regulators would have to provide the funds. But this meant issuing more bonds, further impairing sovereign credit, which hurt bank balance sheets more, spawning a death spiral of simultaneously imploding sovereign and bank credit. Only new capital from outside sources, whose own credit was not impaired, could break the cycle. After 3 years of on-again, off-again crises and contagion, the solution was finally found in the troika of the IMF, the ECB, and the EU, backstopped by Germany. The IMF obtained its funds by borrowing from nations with healthy reserve balances, such as China and Canada. The EU raised funds by pooling member resources, largely from Germany. Finally, the ECB created funds by printing money as needed. The Troika members operated under the central banker's new mantra, whatever it takes. By late 2012, the European sovereign debt and bank crisis was largely contained, although rebuilding bank balance sheets and making the required structural adjustments will take years to complete. Despite this turmoil, the euro held up quite well, to the surprise of many analysts and investors, especially those in the United States. In July 2008, the euro reached a peak of $1.60 and remained in a trading range between $1.20 and $1.60 during the sovereign debt crisis. Throughout the turmoil, the euro always traded at a higher dollar price, than where it began in 1999. The euro has also increased its share of global reserves significantly since its issue date. The IMF maintains a data time series showing the composition of official foreign exchange reserves broken down by currency. Data for the first quarter of 1999 show that the euro comprised 18.1% of global allocated foreign exchange reserves. By the end of 2012, after 3 years of crisis, the euro's share had risen to 23.9% of global reserves. Such objective data is at odds with the histrionics produced by the Euroskeptics, and that helps explain why, by early 2013, the prophets of Euro doom were mostly mute on the subject of a Eurozone breakup. The skeptics had committed a succession of analytic failures, easily seen even at the hysteria's height in early 2012. The first analytic failure involved the zero-sum nature of cross-exchange rates. Beginning in 2010, the United States initiated a cheap dollar policy intended to import inflation from abroad in the form of higher import prices on energy, electronics, textiles, and other manufactured goods. The cheap dollar policy was made explicit in numerous pronouncements, including President Obama's 2010 State of the Union address, where he announced the National Export Initiative, and former Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke's Tokyo speech on October 14, 2012, in which he threatened trading partners with higher inflation if they did not allow their currencies to strengthen against the dollar. Since the United States wanted a cheap dollar, it wanted a strong euro in dollar terms. In effect, the United States was using powerful policy tools to strengthen the euro. Why this obvious point was lost on many U.S. analysts is a mystery, but a permanently weak euro was always contrary to U.S. policy. The second analytic failure had to do with the tendency to conflate the simultaneous crises in debt, banking, and currencies. Analysts looked at defaulting sovereign bonds in Greece and at weak banks in Spain, then breezily concluded that the euro must weaken also. This is superficial. Economically, there is nothing inconsistent about weak bonds, weak banks, and a strong currency. Lehman Brothers is a case in point. In 2008, Lehman defaulted on billions of dollars in bond obligations. This default meant the end of the bonds, but not the end of the dollar, since the currency in which bonds are issued has a different dynamic than the bonds themselves. A currency's strength has more to do with central bank policy and global capital flows than with the fate of specific bonds in that currency. Analysts who treated European banks and bonds and the single currency as subject to the same distress made a fundamental error. The euro could do quite well despite the fate of Greek bonds and Irish banks. The third analytic blind spot was a failure to recognize that capital flows dominate trade flows in setting exchange rates. Too much emphasis was placed on Europe's perceived lack of export competitiveness, especially in the Eurozone periphery of Ireland, Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece, and Cyprus. Export competitiveness is important when it comes to growth, but it is not the decisive factor in determining exchange rates. Capital flows to the euro from the Federal Reserve in the form of central bank swaps with the ECB, and from China in the form of reserve allocations and direct foreign investment, placed a solid floor under the euro. If the two largest economies in the world, the United States and China, did not want the euro to go down, then it would not go down. The fourth blind spot had to do with the need to lower unit labor costs as part of the structural adjustment required to make peripheral Eurozone economies globally competitive. Eurosceptics suffer from the legacy of misguided Keynesian economics and the sticky wage myth, technically called downward nominal wage rigidity. Keynesians rely on a theory of sticky wages to justify inflation, or theft from savers. The idea is that wages will rise during periods of inflation, but will not decline easily during periods of deflation. They will tend to stick at the old nominal wage levels. As a result, wages fail to adjust downward. Employers fire workers, unemployment rises, and aggregate demand is weakened. A liquidity trap then develops, and deflation becomes worse as the cycle feeds on itself, resulting in impossibly high debt, bankruptcies, and depression. Inflation is considered advisable policy because it allows employers to give workers a nominal raise, even if there is no raise in real terms due to higher prices. Workers receive raises in nominal terms while wages adjust downward in real terms. This is a form of money illusion, or deception of workers by central banks, but it works in theory to lower real unit labor costs. As applied to Europe, the Keynesian view is that the quickest way to achieve the needed inflation is for member nations to quit the euro, revert to a former local currency, and then devalue these currencies. This was the theoretical basis for the many predictions that the euro must fail and that members would quit to help their economies grow. In 21st century economies, all aspects of this theory are flawed, starting with the premise. Sticky wages are a special case, arising in limited conditions where labor is a predominant factor input to productivity. Labor substitutes do not exist, unionization is strong, globalized outsourcing is unavailable, and unemployment is reasonably low. Today, all those factors are reversed. Capital is the predominant factor input. Robotics and outsourcing are readily available, and the union movement is weak in the private sector. Consequently, workers will accept lower nominal wages if that enables them to retain their jobs. This form of lower unit labor costs is known as internal adjustment via lower wages versus external adjustment through a cheaper currency and inflation. External adjustment may have worked in the 1930s in the UK when Keynes first advanced his ideas on sticky wages. However, under 21st century globalized conditions, internal adjustment is a far superior remedy because it treats the problem directly and avoids the exogenous costs of breaking up the Eurozone. As a case in point, on July 2, 2013, Greece's Hellenic Statistical Authority, known as Elstat, reported that private sector salaries in Greece had dropped an average of 22.3% since the first quarter of 2012, a clear refutation of the obsolete sticky wage theories of Keynes and Krugman. The sentiment that sticking with the euro is desirable, despite contracting economies and falling wages, is widely shared among everyday citizens in the Eurozone periphery, despite the pretensions of academic theory. In 2013, Marcus Walker and Alessandra Galloni did extensive reporting on this topic for the Wall Street Journal and revealed the following. They wrote, "Across Europe's southern rim, people recoil at the idea of returning to national currencies, fearing such a step would revive inflation, remove checks on corruption, and derail national ambitions to be part of Europe's inner circle. Such fears outweigh the bleak growth outlook that has prompted many U.S. and UK economists to predict a split of the currency. Only 20% of Italians say leaving the euro would help the economy. Strong majorities in Spain, Portugal, Greece, and Ireland also reject an exit from the euro, recent polls show. Europeans who now use the euro have no desire to abandon it and return to their former currency, according to a survey by the Pew Research Center. In Spain and Portugal, 70% or more of people want to stick with the euro, recent polls found. The fifth and final analytic blind spot of the Euroskeptics was a failure to understand that the euro is, and always has been, a political project rather than an economic one, and that the political will to preserve it was never in doubt. A true understanding of the euro is summarized by leading French intellectual Guy Sormont. He writes, "Europe was not built for economic reasons, but to bring peace between European countries. It is a political ambition. It is the only political project for our generation. We'll pay the price to save this project." In sum, the euro is strong and getting stronger. This tour d'horizon of the Eurosceptics' analytic blind spots not only rebuts their criticism of the euro, but reveals the euro's underlying strengths and future direction. These strengths are part of a larger emergent worldview of how to prosper in a highly competitive, globalized economy. The most encouraging reports involve Greece, the economy that was most reviled. Over $175 million of new money entered the Greek stock market between June 2012 and February 2013. And according to the Wall Street Journal, everything from Greek real estate to energy stocks are finding buyers. In April 2013, the Troika approved the disbursement of further bailout assistance to Greece based on its progress in cutting government spending and moving toward a balanced budget. On May 14, 2013, the Fitch service upgraded Greece's credit rating, and in a review of the Greek economy, the New York Times reported, "The drive to improve competitiveness, mainly through much lower wage costs, is finally bearing fruit too. This is most visible in tourism, which accounts for 17% of gross domestic product. Revenues are expected to jump 9 to 10% this year." Greece is also benefiting from the privatization of government-owned assets. The 1,500-acre former Athens airport site is expected to attract €6 billion of investment to establish a mixed-use development that should create more than 20,000 well-paying jobs. Another recent story from Greece involves events tantamount to a controlled experiment, something economists seek but seldom find. Prior to 2010, port facilities in the major Greek port of Piraeus had been owned by the government. That year, the government sold half the port for €500 million to COSCO, a Chinese shipping concern, while retaining the other half. A comparison of operations in the Chinese and Greek-controlled halves of the facility in 2012 showed a striking contrast. On COSCO's portion of the port, cargo traffic has more than doubled over the last year to 1.05 million containers. And while profit margins are still razor thin, that is mainly because the Chinese company is putting a lot of its money back into the port. The Greek-run side of the port endured a series of debilitating worker strikes in the 3 years before COSCO came to town. On the Greek side of the port, union rules required that 9 people work a gantry crane. COSCO uses a crew of 4. This comparison perfectly illustrates the fact that there is nothing intrinsically non-competitive about Greek workers or Greek infrastructure. Greece needs only more flexible work rules, lower unit labor costs, and new capital. Chinese capital is a conspicuous part of the solution, and Chinese investors, such as COSCO, are willing to commit capital when a productive business climate can be assured. Developments in Spain are equally encouraging. Spanish unit labor costs have already dropped over 7% relative to Germany, and economists expect further decreases. In February 2012, Spain's Prime Minister, Mariano Rajoy, implemented laws that increased labor flexibility by allowing employers to terminate workers in a downturn, reduce severance pay, and renegotiate contracts entered into during the property boom prior to 2008. The result was a drastic increase in Spain's competitiveness in manufacturing, especially the automotive industry. The positive effect was immediate. Renault announced plans to increase production in the northern Spanish city of Palencia. Ford Motor Company and Peugeot also announced increased production at their plants in Spain. In October 2012, Volkswagen announced an €800 million investment in its plant near Barcelona. All these investment and expansion plans will have positive ripple effects because the large manufacturers are tied to a network of parts suppliers and subcontractors throughout Spain. The expanded employment and output as the result of lower wages in Spain is a refutation of the sticky wage theories of Keynes and Krugman, and it's happening on a widespread scale from Greece to Ireland. Although this is a difficult and painful adjustment, the shift is sustainable, and it leaves Europe well positioned to be a globally competitive manufacturing base and magnet for capital inflows. The Economist, along with many others, has cited adverse demographics as a major hurdle in the way of more robust European growth. Europe does have a rapidly aging society, as do Russia, Japan, China, and other major economies. Over a 20-year horizon, the demographics of working-age populations are rigid in a closed society, which can be a large determinant of economic outcomes. But this view ignores forms of flexibility, even in a closed society. A working-age population is not the same as a workforce. When unemployment is high, as it is in much of Europe, new entrants can come into the workforce at a much higher rate than population growth, assuming jobs are available. The pools of well-educated unemployed are so large in Europe today that demography places no short-term constraints on productive labor factor inputs. As noted, improved labor mobility can also facilitate growth in the productive workforce by enabling unemployed workers in the Eurozone's depressed regions to move to more productive regions to supply the labor needed. Immigration from Eastern Europe and Turkey can supply ample labor to Western Europe, much as the Chinese interior has supplied labor to Chinese coastal factories for decades. In short, demographics are not a constraint on European growth as long as there is underutilized labor, labor mobility, and immigration. Internal economic adjustment alone may not be enough to secure the future of the euro and the EU more broadly. Expansions of the institutions of the EU will also be required, as captured in Merkel's phrase, "more Europe." The EU is like an aircraft with a single wing. It can choose to remain grounded, or it can build the other wing. Efforts to deal with the immediate crises in 2010 and 2011, including monetary ease and multilateral bailout packages, have been sufficient to avoid a collapse, but they are not sufficient to correct the fundamental contradictions in the design of the euro and the ECB. A single currency has been shown to be dysfunctional without uniformity of fiscal policy and bank regulation, along with improved mobility of labor and capital among currency union members. The good news is that these deficiencies are well understood by political and financial leaders in Europe and are being remedied at a rapid pace. On January 1, 2013, the EU Fiscal Stability Treaty entered into force for the 16 EU member nations that had ratified it as of that date, including all the periphery nations. The treaty contains binding procedures requiring signatories to have budget deficits of less than 3% of GDP, when their debt-to-GDP ratio is under 60%. In cases where the debt-to-GDP ratio exceeds 60%, the deficit must be less than 0.5% of GDP. The treaty also contains the so-called debt brake that requires signatories with a debt-to-GDP ratio in excess of 60% to reduce the ratio by 5% of the excess each year until the ratio is less than 60%. Treaty provisions are implemented and enforced at the member level for the time being, but the treaty stipulates that the members will incorporate the treaty rules in the overall EU legal framework before January 1, 2018. An EU-wide bank deposit insurance program to mitigate banking panics is currently under construction, as are proposals to replace separate sovereign bonds issued by Eurozone members with true Eurobonds backed by the credit of the Eurozone as a whole. Actions on these fronts may follow, but first, further progress must be made on fiscal restraint and other market reforms. The threads of banking union and consolidated bailout funds have begun to intertwine. In June 2013, a Euro working group of senior finance ministry officials from the Eurozone announced a €60 billion bailout fund to provide direct support to banks in distress. Beyond these fiscal and banking reforms, the EU's future is further brightened by the accession of new members either to the EU, the Eurozone, or both. In July 2013, Latvia received approval from the European Commission and the ECB to adopt the euro as its currency. Croatia officially became an EU member on July 1, 2013, and its central bank governor, Boris Vučić, announced that Croatia wanted to move as quickly as possible to full adoption of the euro as its currency. Candidate countries whose membership in the EU is underway but not yet completed are Montenegro, Serbia, Macedonia, and Turkey. Potential candidates who do not yet meet the requirements for EU membership but are working toward conformity are Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Kosovo. In the future, it is not too much to expect that Scotland and Ukraine may apply for membership. The EU is already the largest economic power in the world, with combined GDP greater than that of the United States and more than double that of China and Japan. Over the next 10 years, the EU is destined to evolve into the world's economic superpower, stretching from Asia Minor to Greenland and from the Arctic Ocean to the Sahara Desert. Germany sits at the heart of this vast economic and demographic domain. While Germany cannot control the entire region politically, it will be the greatest economic power within the region. Through its indirect control of the ECB and the euro, it will dominate commerce, finance, and trade. Eurobonds will provide a deep, liquid pool of investable assets, larger than the U.S. Treasury bond market. If needed, the euro can be supported by its members' combined gold holdings, which exceeded 10,000 tons, about 25% more than the U.S. Treasury's official gold holdings. This combination of large, liquid bond markets, a sound currency, and huge gold reserves may enable the euro to displace the dollar as the world's leading reserve currency by 2025. This prospect will hearten Russia and China, which have been seeking escape from U.S. dollar hegemony since 2009. Germany is also the key to this monetary evolution because of its insistence on sound money, and because of the example it has set of how to be an export giant without a weak currency. Germany's new Reich, intermediated through the EU, the euro, and the ECB, will be the greatest expression of German social, political, and economic influence since Charlemagne's reign. Even though it will come at the expense of the dollar, the changes will be positive in most ways because of Germany's productivity and its adherence to democratic values. Europe's diverse historical and cultural landscape will be preserved within an improved economic framework. With German leadership and foresight, the EU motto, "United in Diversity," will be realized in its truest form.